You don't stay poor because you don't work hard. You don't stay poor because you're stupid. You don't stay poor because you lack motivation. You stay poor because of how you think. And that is the most uncomfortable truth most people will spend their entire lives avoiding. Because changing circumstances feels easier than changing thought patterns. Because blaming systems feels safer than confronting habits. Because effort feels noble, but awareness feels threatening. And yet, thinking is where poverty is born, and thinking is where it dies. In this audiobook, Thinking Keeps You Poor. You're not going to hear motivational noise. You're not going to hear fantasies. You're not going to hear shortcuts. You are going to hear the uncomfortable mechanisms that quietly keep intelligent, capable people financially trapped for decades. And more importantly, you are going to learn how to dismantle them permanently, because wealth is not created by money first. It is created by mental structure, and once that structure changes, money has no choice but to follow. Most people never escape poverty because they think poverty is about income. It's not. Income is an effect. Wealth is a consequence. Poverty is a pattern of reacting instead of designing, a pattern of consuming instead of compounding, a pattern of surviving instead of building. This audiobook is not about getting rich. It's about destroying poor thinking forever. Because once poor thinking is gone, poverty cannot survive in your life, even if you start with nothing. And that matters, because history proves something brutal. Some people work their entire lives and die exactly where they started, not because they failed, but because they never questioned the rules they were given. Think about that. How many beliefs about money did you inherit without ever consciously choosing them? How many rules were handed down to you by people who never escaped themselves? How many limitations did you adopt because they sounded responsible, safe, or realistic? Most people never ask these questions. That's why most people stay exactly where they are. This audiobook is divided into a journey, a dismantling. We will expose the hidden thinking patterns that keep people trapped. We will tear A-chapter survival logic. We will rewire how you see effort, risk, time, value, and leverage. We will replace short-term relief with long-term architecture. And by the end, you will no longer try to think differently. You will be incapable of thinking poor thoughts the same way again. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Let's start with the first lie that keeps people poor. The lie that sounds like wisdom. The lie that ruins generations. The lie called work hard and you'll be fine. Hard work has never made anyone wealthy. Hard work makes people tired. Effort without leverage builds exhaustion, not freedom. Poor thinking glorifies effort because effort feels controllable. Show up, push harder, endure more. But rich thinking asks a different question. Not how hard can I work, but what compounds if I stop trading time for survival? Poor thinking ties worth to struggle. Rich thinking ties value to systems. Poor thinking believes income comes from hours. Rich thinking understands income comes from positioning. That single distinction separates lives. Most people are taught to become useful workers. Almost no one is taught to become valuable thinkers. So they push wheelbarrows of effort, wondering why they never move faster. And when they don't move, they assume they're failing. They're not failing. They're executing a broken mental program flawlessly. In the next chapter, we're going to break down survival thinking, the mindset that keeps people busy, stressed, and financially stagnant for life. And once you recognize it in yourself, you will never unknow it again. Dear viewers, write which city you're from. It's interesting to see which corners of the world are watching our videos. Chapter 2. Most people don't realize they're thinking in survival mode because survival thinking feels normal when you've lived inside it long enough. Survival thinking asks one question on repeat. How do I make it through this month? Not how do I build 5 years from now? Not how do I design leverage? Not how do I position myself for compounding? Just how do I survive now? And survival thinking is deadly to wealth because survival thinking forces you to trade the future for relief every time. You take the safe option instead of the strategic one. You grab certainty instead of upside. You cling to what's familiar instead of what's scalable, and you call it responsibility. This is why poor thinking doesn't look reckless. It looks cautious. It looks practical. It looks sensible. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Survival thinking keeps you busy enough to feel productive, but too distracted to build. It keeps you solving urgent problems instead of important ones. It teaches you to optimize expenses instead of increasing leverage, to budget harder instead of redesigning income, to cut costs instead of expanding value. And slowly, quietly, your life becomes a series of short-term patches instead of long-term construction. Rich thinking does the opposite. Rich thinking sacrifices short-term comfort for long-term position. Not recklessly, not blindly, deliberately. Here's the difference. Survival thinkers ask, how do I avoid losing? Builders ask, how do I create optionality? Survival thinkers avoid risk. Builders manage it. Survival thinkers protect what little they have. Builders structure systems that grow without constant effort. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If your main financial strategy is don't mess up, you're already trapped. Because wealth is not created by avoiding mistakes. It's created by owning asymmetry. One decision that compounds for years beats 1,000 decisions that keep you afloat. Poor thinking obsesses over daily outcomes. Rich thinking obsesses over trajectories. And trajectories don't care how busy you feel. They care about direction. This is why some people work non-stop and stay stuck, while others appear calm and keep moving forward. They are playing different games. One is playing defense. The other is designing offense. And defense never wins long term. Defense just delays loss. Now here's where most people get uncomfortable, because survival thinking feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels adult. But ask yourself this honestly. Has survival thinking ever made you feel secure, or has it kept you permanently anxious, even when things were okay? Because survival thinking doesn't end. The goalposts move. Bills get paid, new ones appear, income increases, lifestyle expands, relief arrives, then disappears. There is no finish line in survival mode. That's why people feel exhausted without progress. They're sprinting on a treadmill of urgency. And the tragedy is this: survival thinking convinces you that this is just how life is. It tells you wealth is for other people, that freedom requires luck, that stability means settling. None of that is true. It's just inherited thinking. And inherited thinking is the most expensive thing you'll ever own. In the next chapter, we're going to expose one of the most toxic beliefs ever normalized in society: the belief that time is money. Because that single phrase has destroyed more wealth potential than ignorance ever could. Once you see why, You'll understand why so many hard-working people never break free. Dear viewer, we strive to create high-quality videos for you. Please assist us in improving our efforts by commenting on what you like about the video and what you would change or add. We would be very grateful. Chapter 3. The phrase time is money sounds intelligent. It sounds efficient. It sounds practical. It sounds like wisdom passed down from people who figured it out. But it's one of the most destructive lies ever embedded into modern thinking. Because time is not money, time is finite. Money is renewable. And when you confuse the two, you build your entire life on a ceiling you can never break. Poor thinking treats time as something to be sold. Rich thinking treats time as something to be freed. That single distinction changes everything. If time is money, then the fastest way to earn is to sell more hours. If time is leverage, then the fastest way to earn is to decouple income from presence. Poor thinking worships effort. Rich thinking worships structure. And this is why people proudly say things like, "I work 60 hours a week," as if exhaustion were a badge of honor. They think effort equals progress. But effort without leverage just burns life faster. Every hour you sell has a cap. You only get 24 per day. You only have so much energy. You only have so many years. When income is tied to hours, wealth becomes mathematically impossible past a point. You can optimize, you can grind, you can hustle, but you cannot scale. And scale is what creates freedom. This is why poor thinking celebrates hard workers, while rich thinking quietly builds systems that work without constant input. One produces fatigue, the other produces compounding. And compounding doesn't care how hard you work. It cares how well you position. Here's where most people get defensive. They say, "But I don't have capital. But I don't have opportunities. But I don't have options." That's not the problem. The problem is thinking in transactions instead of systems. Poor thinking asks, "How do I get paid for this?" Rich thinking asks, "How does this keep paying me after I stop touching it?" Poor thinking trades labor for money. Rich thinking trades solutions for leverage. And no, this does not mean everyone needs a business. That's another misunderstanding. Rich thinking is not about entrepreneurship. It's about ownership. Ownership of skills that compound. Ownership of systems that scale. Ownership of decisions that create optionality. Even inside jobs, rich thinkers look for leverage. They build rare skills. They position themselves where impact matters. They attach themselves to outcomes, not tasks. Poor thinking stays busy. Rich thinking stays useful at scale. And this is why two people in the same role can end up with completely different lives. One waits for raises. The other creates a symmetry. One hopes loyalty will be rewarded. The other makes themselves expensive to replace. This is not arrogance. It's awareness. Now let's talk about the next trap. Because even when people understand leverage intellectually, they sabotage themselves emotionally. They fall into the thinking pattern that keeps people poor for decades. Short-term relief over long-term position. Poor thinking optimizes for how things feel now. Rich thinking optimizes for how things work later. Poor thinking says, "I'll take the sure thing." Rich thinking says, "I'll take the asymmetric thing." Poor thinking avoids discomfort. Rich thinking tolerates it strategically. And discomfort is unavoidable when building anything that compounds. The early stages of leverage feel slow. They feel uncertain. They feel unrewarded. And poor thinking interprets that as failure. Rich thinking interprets it as investment. This is why most people quit right before the curve bends upward. They don't lack discipline. They lack a time horizon. They expect linear results in a nonlinear world. And when progress doesn't feel immediate, they retreat to safety. Safety feels good. Safety feels responsible. But safety traps you inside what already exists. And what already exists is usually not enough. In the next chapter, we're going to dismantle the habit that quietly destroys momentum more than anything else: consuming instead of building. Because consumption feels productive, but it never changes your position. And once you understand why, you'll never confuse movement with progress again. Dear friend, you are definitely on the right track if you are watching this video. Like, subscribe, and write in the comments which topic or problem concerns you the most. Chapter 4. Consumption is the most socially acceptable form of stagnation. It looks like learning. It feels like progress. It gives the brain the satisfaction of movement without demanding any structural change. And poor thinking loves consumption. It scrolls, it watches, it listens, it saves, it bookmarks, but it never builds. This is one of the cruelest traps of the modern world because information is abundant and progress is rare. People consume content about success instead of constructing systems that create it. They watch videos about wealth instead of redesigning how value flows through their life. They mistake familiarity with ideas for transformation. And then they wonder why nothing changes. Poor thinking confuses input with output. Rich thinking measures progress by what exists after attention leaves. What did you create? What did you own? What did you compound? Consumption disappears the moment you stop feeding it. Building stays. This is why wealthy people consume very little compared to how much they create. They don't need constant stimulation. They need clarity and execution. Poor thinking treats learning as entertainment. Rich thinking treats learning as ammunition. And ammunition is useless if never fired. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. Most people are addicted to consumption because building is uncomfortable. Building exposes ignorance. Building creates friction. Building produces slow feedback. Consumption feels clean. You can stop anytime. You can switch topics. You can feel smart without risk. But nothing compounds. This is why poor thinking constantly seeks one more idea, one more book, one more strategy, one more video. They believe the missing piece is information. It's not. The missing piece is commitment to creation. Rich thinking commits early. It builds while uncertain. It executes while imperfect. It improves after reality responds. Poor thinking waits for confidence. And confidence never arrives without evidence, which only comes from doing. This is the loop. Consumption delays creation. Creation creates clarity. Clarity builds confidence. Skip creation and the loop never starts. Now let's talk about another belief that destroys wealth silently. I'll start when I'm ready. This sentence has ended more futures than failure ever could, because readiness is emotional, not factual. You will never feel ready to build something that matters. You will feel exposed. You will feel underqualified. You will feel uncertain. Poor thinking interprets that feeling as a stop sign. Rich thinking recognizes it as the cost of entry. Every person who built wealth felt unready. They moved anyway, and here's why. Because rich thinking understands something poor thinking doesn't. You don't prepare for leverage, you enter it. You don't train confidence first. You earn it through repetition. Waiting to feel ready is just fear wearing polite language, and fear, when obeyed long enough, becomes a lifestyle. Now we need to talk about the most dangerous habit of all. The habit that ensures people stay exactly where they are, even while improving. Incremental thinking. Poor thinking believes small, safe steps will eventually lead to freedom. They won't. Incremental improvements inside a broken system just optimize the prison. Rich thinking makes structural changes, not marginal ones. It doesn't ask, how do I save a little more? It asks, how do I change the game entirely? This is why rich thinking feels risky at first, because it threatens existing identity. It requires saying, this structure cannot take me where I want to go. Most people never say that. They tinker instead. They upgrade comfort. They refine survival. They optimize limitation, and decades pass. In the next chapter, we're going to confront the belief that keeps people emotionally attached to poor thinking, the belief that stability comes from certainty. Because certainty is comforting, but it is not stabilizing. And once you understand that difference, you'll stop clinging to safe paths that quietly cap your future. Chapter 5. Certainty feels like safety. That's why poor thinking clings to it. A steady paycheck, a predictable routine, a known outcome, even if it's limiting. Certainty reduces anxiety in the short term, but certainty is not stability. Certainty freezes motion. Stability absorbs shock. And those are not the same thing. Poor thinking believes stability comes from knowing what will happen. Rich thinking understands stability comes from being able to respond when things don't. That's why people with the most secure paths panic the hardest when disruption hits. Their identity is built on predictability. Remove predictability and everything collapses. Rich thinking builds adaptability instead. It doesn't need certainty, it needs capacity. Capacity to adjust. Capacity to learn fast. Capacity to pivot without emotional breakdown. That capacity comes from leverage, not guarantees, and this is where most people sabotage themselves. They trade long-term adaptability for short-term calm. They choose jobs they hate because they're secure. They avoid opportunities because they're uncertain. They reject growth because it threatens comfort, and then they call it responsibility. But responsibility that traps you is not responsibility. It's fear with a respectable name. Rich thinking does not reject security. It just refuses to confuse security with stagnation. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Stability does not come from fixed outcomes. It comes from multiple options. When you have options, uncertainty stops being scary. When you have leverage, volatility becomes opportunity. Poor thinking puts all its weight on one pillar, one job, one income stream, one identity, and then lives in fear of losing it. Rich thinking distributes weight. It builds skills that transfer. It builds relationships that open doors. It builds systems that don't collapse when one input fails. This is why rich thinking looks calm under pressure. They're not fearless. They're not cornered. Now let's talk about the belief that quietly poisons ambition. I'm just being realistic. This sentence sounds mature. It sounds grounded. It sounds intelligent. But most of the time, it's just poor thinking protecting itself. Realism, when misused, becomes a cage. I'm being realistic often means I don't want to risk being wrong. I don't want to look foolish. I don't want to feel exposed. Rich thinking asks a different question. Not, is this realistic? But, is this structurally possible? Because realism is emotional. Structure is factual. Plenty of things feel unrealistic until someone builds them. Every wealthy outcome was once labeled unrealistic by people who didn't pursue it, not because it was impossible, but because it threatened existing beliefs. Poor thinking uses realism to avoid discomfort. Rich thinking uses feasibility to design paths, and feasibility changes with leverage. The more leverage you build, the more realistic your goals become, not because the world changed, but because you did. Now we need to talk about another destructive habit, confusing movement with momentum. Poor thinking loves being busy. Busy feels productive. Busy feels responsible. Busy keeps doubt quiet. But busyness without direction is just disguised avoidance. You can be busy for 30 years and never build wealth, because wealth doesn't respond to activity. It responds to alignment. Alignment between effort and outcome, between input and leverage, between time and trajectory. Rich thinking asks, if I do this for 5 years, where will it take me? Poor thinking asks, what do I need to do today to feel okay? One builds futures, the other manages anxiety. And anxiety management is expensive. It costs time, it costs opportunity, it costs growth. This is why rich thinkers tolerate short-term discomfort. They don't numb it with busyness. They sit inside it because they know discomfort is temporary, but position is permanent. In the next chapter, we're going to expose the thinking habit that keeps people addicted to small wins. Instant gratification disguised as reward. Because rewards, when misused, become anchors. And once you understand how this works, you'll see why so many people never escape the cycle, even when they're earning more than ever. If you appreciate our efforts and our thoughts, subscribe and like this video. We need to show the world that there are many people like us. We must always continue to improve. Chapter 6. Instant gratification feels like reward. That's why poor thinking defends it so fiercely. After a hard week, you deserve something. After stress, you've earned relief. After effort, you need a payoff. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. But instant gratification has a hidden cost. It trains your brain to expect now instead of later. And wealth only appears later. Poor thinking rewards effort immediately. Rich thinking delays reward intentionally. Not because rich thinkers are disciplined superheroes, but because they understand reinforcement. What you reward, you repeat. If you reward yourself for effort, you become addicted to effort. If you reward yourself for outcomes that compound, you become addicted to systems. Poor thinking celebrates activity. Rich thinking celebrates position. This is why many people earn more money than ever and still feel stuck. They upgraded rewards, bigger house, better car, more comfort, but their structure never changed. So lifestyle expands, pressure returns, and the cycle resets. This is not bad luck, it's predictable psychology. Instant gratification keeps you anchored to the present. Delayed gratification builds futures. And the difference is not moral, it's mechanical. Your brain adapts to what you reinforce. Reward short-term relief, and long-term patience dies. Reward long-term progress, and impulse weakens. This is why rich thinking is not about deprivation. It's about reordering rewards. Rich thinkers don't eliminate pleasure. They schedule it after leverage is built. They enjoy more later by tolerating less now. Poor thinking enjoys more now and pays for it forever. Now let's talk about a belief that quietly kills ambition. Money changes people. You've heard it. Maybe you believe it. And it sounds wise, but it's incomplete. Money doesn't change people. Money reveals them. And poor thinking uses this belief to justify staying small. I don't want to become greedy. I don't want to lose myself. I don't want to be one of those people. So they stay exactly where they are, struggling, stressed, constrained, not because money is bad, but because they fear what growth might expose. Rich thinking understands this. If money reveals who you are, then becoming wealthy is a test of character, not a threat to it. Avoiding growth doesn't preserve virtue. It preserves limitation. And limitation is not morality. It's fear disguised as principle. Now we need to address another habit that locks people into poverty thinking, externalizing control. Poor thinking believes outcomes are controlled by forces outside the self. The economy, the system, the government, luck, timing. These things matter, but not the way poor thinking uses them. Poor thinking uses external factors as final explanations. Rich thinking uses them as variables. Variables can be adjusted for. Final explanations end action. I can't because it's impossible because there's no point because those sentences feel honest, but their intellectual surrender. Rich thinking asks, given these constraints, what still works? Poor thinking waits for conditions to improve. Rich thinking builds despite conditions. This is why rich thinkers move forward in bad economies, while poor thinkers freeze in good ones. Because the core difference is not circumstance, it's orientation. One asks for permission, the other looks for leverage, and leverage exists everywhere, in skills, in relationships, in timing, in asymmetry, but only if you're trained to see it. In the next chapter, we're going to confront the most emotionally seductive poor thinking habit of all, identity attachment to struggle. Because some people don't just tolerate poverty thinking, they identify with it. And until that identity is dismantled, no strategy will ever hold. Chapter 7. There is a form of poverty that has nothing to do with money. It lives in identity, and it is one of the hardest forms to escape. Because when struggle becomes identity, escape feels like betrayal. Poor thinking doesn't just say, this is my situation. It says, this is who I am. I've always struggled. People like me don't get ahead. We're not meant for that kind of life. At first, these sound like observations. They're not. They're commitments. Once struggle becomes chapter of identity, progress feels unsafe. Success feels foreign. Stability feels suspicious. Ease feels undeserved. So people self-sabotage, not consciously, emotionally. They earn more, then spend more. They gain momentum, then retreat. They approach freedom, then panic, because their nervous system is calibrated for struggle. And anything outside that range feels wrong. This is why some people feel uncomfortable when things go well. They don't trust calm, they trust chaos. Chaos is familiar. Chaos confirms identity. Rich thinking requires something far more difficult than effort. It requires identity rupture. It requires letting go of the story that explains why you are where you are. And stories are powerful. They protect ego. They soften disappointment. They make stagnation feel justified. But they also keep you trapped because you will always behave in alignment with who you believe you are. If you believe you are bad with money, you will eventually prove it. If you believe wealth is not for people like you will unconsciously avoid it. Not because you're weak, because identity is stronger than intention. Rich thinking does not attack identity directly. It replaces it through evidence, small wins, consistent positioning, repeated proof that you can build. Identity shifts after behavior changes, not before. This is why poor thinking waits for confidence. Rich thinking builds confidence by acting without it. Now let's confront another belief that sounds humble, but is lethal. I'm just grateful for what I have. Gratitude is powerful, but misused, it becomes a leash. Poor thinking uses gratitude to suppress ambition. It says, I shouldn't want more. I should be content. Others have it worse. This shuts down growth. Rich thinking understands something crucial. Gratitude and ambition are not opposites. You can appreciate what you have and still build something better. Gratitude grounds you. Ambition directs you. Poor thinking confuses acceptance with resignation. Rich thinking practices acceptance without surrender. This is why rich thinkers don't feel guilty for wanting more. They see growth as responsibility, not greed. More capacity means more options. More options mean more impact. More impact means more freedom. Staying small does not make you virtuous. It makes you limited, and limitation helps no one. Now we need to talk about a habit that quietly keeps people stuck. Waiting for permission. Poor thinking waits for approval, for validation, for the right time, for someone else to go first. Rich thinking moves without applause. It doesn't announce plans prematurely. It doesn't seek consensus. It doesn't ask if it's allowed, because permission is rarely granted. It's taken. And the people who wait for it often wait forever. This is why most breakthroughs look overnight to outsiders. They weren't. They were built quietly, while others waited to feel ready. In the next chapter, we're going to dismantle one of the most comforting lies ever sold. Slow and steady wins the race, because while patience matters, misunderstood patience keeps people crawling in the wrong direction. And once you understand the difference between patience and paralysis, your sense of urgency will finally align with reality. Dear viewer, please write in the comments what interested you most in the video. This will help us improve our videos. Chapter 8, Slow and Steady Wins the Race, is one of the most misunderstood phrases in modern thinking, because most people use it to justify never changing direction. They move slowly, but they also move blindly. They stay patient inside broken systems. They endure paths that lead nowhere. That's not patience. That's paralysis disguised as virtue. Rich thinking understands the difference. Patience is not about speed, it's about direction. Slow progress in the wrong direction compounds disaster. Fast progress in the wrong direction compounds it faster. But clear direction, even with slow steps, changes everything. Poor thinking uses patience to tolerate limitation. Rich thinking uses patience to let leverage mature. Poor thinking says, I'll just keep doing this a little longer. Rich thinking says, this direction doesn't scale. I need to redesign. This is why some people are patient for 20 years and never escape. They're loyal to effort instead of outcome. They confuse consistency with correctness. Rich thinking is consistent after direction is right, not before. Now let's confront a belief that quietly sabotages upward movement. I can't afford to think long-term right now. This sentence feels honest. Bills exist. Pressure is real. Urgency is constant. But here's the trap. If you don't think long-term when things are hard, you never will. Poor thinking waits for relief to plan. Rich thinking plans to create relief. Long-term thinking is not a luxury. It's the exit strategy. Even 5 minutes a week spent designing leverage beats 50 hours spent reacting. Because reaction never ends. Design does. This is why rich thinkers carve out thinking time even when overwhelmed. They don't wait for space. They create it because they know something poor thinking ignores. If you don't step back to design, you will stay trapped executing someone else's plan. And most people are executing systems that benefit others more than themselves. Now let's talk about another poison belief. I'll fix it when I make more money. This is backwards. Making more money does not fix poor thinking. It amplifies it. If you think poorly at low income, you will think poorly at high income, just with bigger consequences. That's why so many high earners live paycheck to paycheck. The thinking didn't change, only the numbers did. Rich thinking fixes structure first. It builds containers before pouring more in. It designs flow before increasing volume. Poor thinking chases income as a cure. Rich thinking treats income as fuel, useful only when the engine is right. This is why wealth is rarely sudden. Even when money arrives quickly, the thinking that can hold it took years to build. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. Most people don't want to change how they think. They want better results without rewiring identity. They want more money without changing habits, time horizons, or emotional responses. But wealth punishes inconsistency. It demands coherence, and coherence starts in the mind. Now we're going to talk about the habit that quietly destroys coherence: emotional decision-making. Poor thinking makes decisions based on how things feel. Fear chooses safety. Excitement chooses risk. Stress chooses relief. And then logic is used after the fact to justify the choice. Rich thinking separates emotion from authority. Emotion is information, not instruction. Fear signals risk, but does not decide. Excitement signals opportunity, but does not command. Rich thinking builds rules before emotion appears. Rules about spending, rules about investing, rules about when to act and when to wait. Poor thinking decides in the moment. Rich thinking decides in advance. And this one shift alone is responsible for more wealth differences than talent ever will be. In the next chapter, we're going to dismantle the belief that keeps people emotionally attached to smallness, the fear of outgrowing your environment. Because sometimes staying poor isn't about money at all. It's about who you'd have to become and who you'd have to leave behind. And that is where poor thinking fights the hardest. The topic of this video was chosen by you, our viewers. In most of our videos, we remind you that you can write interesting topics you would like to hear about in the comments. We take the most interesting ones into consideration. Today's video topic was suggested by one of our viewers in the comments. Katya, thank you for this theme. If you want us to cover a topic that interests you, write it in the comments. This will help us make videos on topics that are interesting to you, our viewers. Chapter 9. Outgrowing your environment is one of the quietest fears no one talks about. Not fear of failure, fear of separation. Poor thinking is often socially reinforced. Friends who share the same struggles, family who normalize limitation, communities bonded by shared scarcity. When you begin to think differently, something uncomfortable happens. You stop agreeing automatically. You stop laughing at the same jokes. You stop participating in the same complaints. And that creates distance. Not because you think you're better, but because you're no longer thinking the same. This is where many people retreat. Not because the path forward is unclear, but because the emotional cost feels too high. They slow down. They soften ambition. They reframe goals to fit the room they're in, and they call it loyalty. But loyalty that requires self-limitation is not loyalty. It's fear of isolation. Rich thinking understands this early. Growth creates friction. Not everyone will understand. Not everyone will support it. Not everyone will stay. And that's not cruelty. It's consequence. You cannot redesign your life without redesigning your reference points. Poor thinking clings to familiar environments even when they reinforce smallness. Rich thinking seeks alignment, not approval. This doesn't mean abandoning people. It means no longer letting collective comfort dictate individual potential, because the fastest way to shrink ambition is to constantly explain it to people who don't share it. Now let's talk about another deeply embedded belief. I don't want too much responsibility. This sounds humble, but it's another poor thinking trap. Responsibility is framed as burden. More money equals more stress. More success equals more pressure. More freedom equals more problems. So people cap themselves intentionally. They stay manageable. Rich thinking reframes responsibility. Responsibility is control. Responsibility is choice. Responsibility is optionality. When you have responsibility, you have authority over outcomes. Poor thinking avoids responsibility and then complains about lack of control. Rich thinking accepts responsibility and designs systems to carry it. This is why wealthy people don't feel overwhelmed by scale. They don't carry everything personally. They delegate to systems. Poor thinking carries everything emotionally. And emotional load is what exhausts people, not responsibility itself. Now we need to confront one of the most damaging myths of all. I just need to be disciplined. Discipline is not the solution. Discipline is a temporary patch. Poor thinking relies on willpower. Willpower fails under stress. It collapses under fatigue. It disappears under emotion. Rich thinking builds environments where discipline is unnecessary. Automatic systems, pre-made decisions, structural guardrails. This is why wealthy people don't constantly fight temptation. They removed it. They don't rely on strength. They rely on design. Poor thinking tries harder. Rich thinking removes friction. This is why people burn out trying to change habits without changing structure. Habits live inside systems. Change the system. Habits follow. Now let's address the belief that keeps people endlessly preparing. I need one more skill. Skill acquisition feels productive, and it is until it becomes avoidance. Poor thinking stacks skills without application, always learning, never deploying. Rich thinking learns just enough to move forward, then learns more after reality responds. Skill without application is storage. Application creates feedback. Feedback creates growth. And growth compounds. This is why rich thinkers are often less qualified on paper. They moved sooner. They learned in public. They learned through consequence. They learned through iteration. Poor thinking waits to be complete. Rich thinking moves while incomplete. Because completeness is a myth. Now, we're approaching a critical turning point. Because once poor thinking is exposed, the real challenge begins. Not understanding it, letting it go. In the next chapter, we're going to confront the most dangerous moment in transformation. The moment when old thinking tries to return. Not through fear, but through comfort. Because comfort doesn't announce itself as an enemy. It invites you back quietly. And unless you're prepared, it will undo everything. Chapter 10. Comfort is not loud. That's why it's dangerous. Fear announces itself. Failure leaves scars. Pain demands attention. But comfort whispers. It says, "You've done enough. You can relax now. This isn't so bad. You deserve a break." And poor thinking loves comfort because comfort asks for nothing. No risk, no identity change, no difficult decisions, just maintenance. This is where most transformations quietly die, not in crisis, in calm. People escape survival mode and stop building. They earn a little more and settle. They feel less pressure and mistake relief for arrival. Comfort convinces you that the work is done when it has only just begun. Rich thinking treats comfort carefully, not as an enemy, but as a signal to stabilize, not to stop, a signal to lock in structure, not abandon momentum. Poor thinking uses comfort as permission to disengage. Rich thinking uses comfort as a foundation to scale. This is why people plateau, not because they fail, but because they relax too early. They stop redesigning. They stop questioning assumptions. They stop pushing leverage forward. And slowly, the old thinking creeps back in. Spending rises, focus drops, urgency returns, and suddenly they're back where they started, just with better furniture. Now, let's confront another belief that kills long-term growth. I'll enjoy life later. This sounds like discipline, but it's often self-deception. Poor thinking swings between extremes, either reckless pleasure now or delayed joy forever. Rich thinking integrates enjoyment without sacrificing position. It doesn't postpone life. It designs life to be sustainable, because burnout destroys wealth faster than laziness ever could. The goal is not misery. The goal is alignment. Alignment between effort and meaning, between ambition and health, between building and living. Poor thinking believes you must suffer to succeed. Rich thinking knows suffering without structure is wasted. Effort must move something. Otherwise, it's just pain with a story attached. Now we need to talk about a trap that looks like ambition, comparison-driven growth. Poor thinking measures progress by others, their income, their lifestyle, their timeline. This creates false urgency. You rush decisions to catch up. You chase outcomes without foundations. You buy signals of success instead of building substance. Comparison hijacks strategy. It turns your life into a reaction to someone else's highlight reel. Rich thinking avoids comparison, not out of humility, but out of efficiency. Comparison introduces noise. Noise clouds judgment. Judgment errors cost time. Time is the only thing you can't replace. Rich thinking measures progress internally. Am I more leveraged than last year? Am I more optional? Am I less reactive? Am I building something that compounds? Those questions don't trend on social media, but they build futures. Now let's address a subtle but deadly habit, confusing planning with protection. Poor thinking plans excessively to feel safe. Spreadsheets, scenarios, backup plans for backup plans. Planning becomes a way to avoid exposure. But planning does not protect you. Execution does. Rich thinking plans just enough to move. Then it adjusts in real time. Because no plan survives contact with reality. And people who overplan often underbuild. They feel productive, but nothing exists. Rich thinking values feedback over fantasy. Feedback requires action, and action requires courage, not reckless courage, structural courage. The courage to commit knowing revision is inevitable. Now we are approaching a critical shift, because at some point, poor thinking doesn't disappear. It tries to negotiate. It says, just this once. You've earned flexibility. You can bend the rules now. This is the final test, not discipline, identity. Will you return to emotional decision-making once pressure fades? Or will you hold structure even when no one is watching? Rich thinking is not proven in struggle. It is proven in ease. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about what happens when poor thinking finally loses its grip. Not dramatically, quietly, and how to lock that change in permanently So you never have to fight the same battle again. Because real wealth is not about winning once. It's about never having to restart. Please like and subscribe if you want a better future for your children, your family, and yourself. It's very difficult to achieve success today, but I'm sure you'll succeed. All you have to do is learn and discover new things. Chapter 11. There is a moment when poor thinking stops shouting. It doesn't fight anymore. It doesn't argue. It simply fades. Not because you defeated it with force, but because it no longer fits who you've become. This is how real change happens. Quietly. One day you notice you didn't react. You didn't reach for relief. You didn't default to old habits. You paused. You chose. You moved forward without drama. That's when you know the thinking shifted. Because poor thinking survives on emotional urgency. When urgency disappears, it starves. Rich thinking does not require constant motivation. It runs on structure, and structure outlasts emotion every time. Now let's talk about locking this in permanently. Because insight alone fades. Motivation fades. But systems remain. Rich thinkers do not trust their future selves. They trust design. They assume stress will return. They assume fatigue will appear. They assume emotion will fluctuate. So they prepare. They automate savings. They pre-commit investments. They set boundaries in advance. They remove temptation from reach. Poor thinking believes discipline will save it later. Rich thinking removes the need for discipline. This is why wealth feels effortless from the outside. The effort happened earlier, during design. Now here's the most important distinction of all. Poor thinking focuses on outcomes. Rich thinking focuses on process ownership. Outcomes fluctuate, markets move, income varies, opportunities shift, but process ownership is stable. When you own the process, you can recreate outcomes. When you don't, every success feels fragile. This is why lottery winners go broke. They get money, but not the thinking that creates it. Money without structure is temporary. Structure without money becomes wealth over time. Now let's dismantle the final lie that keeps people mentally poor. I'll always have to worry about money. No, you will always manage money. But worry is not required. Worry is a symptom of chaos. When money has no system, it demands emotional attention. When money is systemized, it becomes quiet. Rich thinking makes money boring. Bills are automated. Savings are invisible. Investments are scheduled. Decisions are rare. Poor thinking keeps money dramatic. Constant checking, constant adjusting, constant stress. Drama feels important, but importance doesn't build wealth. Consistency does. Now, we're entering the final phase of this audiobook. Not more techniques, not more strategies. Integration. Because the goal was never to give you answers. It was to change the questions you ask. You no longer ask, how do I survive this month? You ask, how do I build something that survives without me? You no longer ask, how do I work harder? You ask, how do I position leverage? You no longer ask, how do I feel better right now? You ask, what decision compounds? Those questions create a different life. And once you adopt them, poor thinking has nowhere to hide. In the next message, we'll bring everything together. We'll talk about what it actually means to think like the top 1%. Not in lifestyle, but in mental architecture, because the top 1% don't think faster. They think structurally, and once you do too, poverty thinking doesn't just weaken, it disappears. Chapter 12. Thinking like the top 1% has nothing to do with luxury. It has nothing to do with private jets, watches, or status symbols. Those are outcomes, and outcomes are the last thing rich thinkers focus on. The top 1% think in architecture. They don't ask how to earn more. They ask how value flows. They don't ask how to work harder. They ask how effort multiplies. They don't ask how to win today. They ask how to never restart. Poor thinking lives inside moments. Rich thinking lives inside systems. This is the mental shift that changes everything. When you think in systems, emotions lose power. When you think in systems, discipline becomes optional. When you think in systems, money stops demanding attention. Because systems don't care how you feel. They execute anyway. The wealthy are not calmer because they're better people. They're calmer because fewer decisions require emotion. Most people live decision-heavy lives. Every purchase is debated. Every expense is stressful. Every opportunity is evaluated in panic. Rich thinkers remove decisions. They pre-decide. They automate. They standardize. They limit choice. Choice feels like freedom, but excess choice creates anxiety. Constraint creates peace. That's why minimal systems outperform complex ones. Poor thinking loves complexity because it feels sophisticated. Rich thinking loves simplicity because it works under pressure. Now let's talk about something few people admit. Most people don't fail financially. They leak. Small decisions made emotionally. Small compromises made repeatedly. Small indulgences justified endlessly. Leaks don't feel dangerous. That's why they're ignored. But leaks destroy ships. Rich thinking is obsessed with containment. Where does money escape? Where does attention drain? Where does energy bleed? They fix leaks before chasing growth. Poor thinking chases growth while hemorrhaging underneath. Now here is the most powerful reframe you'll ever hear. Wealth is not about having more. It's about needing less to feel okay. When your nervous system is regulated, when your systems are solid, when your thinking is aligned, money becomes optional, not obsessive. That's when leverage appears, because desperation repels opportunity. Calm attracts it. People trust calm decision makers. Opportunities flow towards stability. Capital follows clarity. This is why emotional regulation is financial strategy, and poor thinking ignores it completely. Now let's talk about the final transformation. At some point, you stop trying to escape poor thinking. You simply don't relate to it anymore. The complaints feel hollow. The excuses sound tired. The panic feels unnecessary. Not because you're superior, but because your frame has shifted. You see long-term consequences instinctively now. You feel misalignment before damage occurs. You correct early. This is the real advantage, not speed, not aggression, not confidence. Early correction, small adjustments made consistently beat dramatic comebacks every time. This is why rich thinkers don't experience rock bottom. They don't fall far enough. Their systems catch them. Now, we are nearing the end of this audiobook. And there is one final truth to anchor everything. Poor thinking is not destroyed by motivation. It is destroyed by replacement. You don't fight old patterns. You outgrow them by thinking in decades instead of days, by designing instead of reacting, by building containers instead of chasing relief. Once your thinking changes, poverty cannot coexist with it, not forever. It might visit, it might test you, but it cannot stay. Because poverty is not a lack of money, it is a lack of structure. And structure is something you now own. In the final message, we will close this journey properly, not with hype, with grounding, with reflection, with a decision that only you can make. about who you are going to be from this point forward. Because once poor thinking is destroyed, there is no going back. Hang on a sec. Hey there, dear viewers, write in the comments what you'd like us to talk about in the next video. We promise to read all the comments and pick the best and most relevant topics. Thanks. Chapter 13. There is a strange quiet that follows real mental change, not excitement, not adrenaline, not the rush of a breakthrough moment. Quiet. Because when poor thinking collapses, the noise it created disappears with it. The constant internal negotiation, the background anxiety, the endless mental math about money, time, and survival, gone. And in that quiet, something unfamiliar appears. Responsibility. Not the heavy kind, the clean kind. The kind that says, I see clearly now. What I build next is on me. This is where many people hesitate. Because clarity removes excuses. You can no longer blame ignorance. You can no longer blame confusion. You can no longer blame lack of information. You know what compounds. You know what leaks. You know what's aligned and what isn't. And knowledge without action becomes pressure. This is why poor thinking often tries one last trick. It pretends clarity is enough. It says, I understand now. That's progress. Understanding is not progress. Execution is. Rich thinking does not celebrate insight. It installs it. It turns insight into rules, rules into systems, systems into habits, and habits into identity. Identity is the final lock. When you become someone who thinks structurally, there is no temptation to return, not because you resist, because the old way no longer makes sense. Now let's talk about the moment most people fear, the moment when external validation doesn't arrive. You change how you think, but no one applauds. You redesign your life quietly, but nothing dramatic happens yet. Poor thinking needs immediate proof. Rich thinking trusts delayed confirmation. This is where patience becomes power. Not passive patience, strategic patience. The kind that knows cause always precedes effect. The kind that doesn't demand applause for discipline. The kind that builds when no one is watching. This is the phase where wealth is actually created, not when money arrives, but when the systems that generate money are stabilized. Now let's dismantle the final illusion. I'll know when I've made it. No, you won't. Because making it is not a moment. It's a condition. The condition where money stops dictating decisions, where stress is no longer financial by default, where time is allocated intentionally, where options exist. You don't wake up one day and feel rich. You wake up and realize nothing feels urgent anymore. That's the signal. Urgency is the enemy of wealth. Urgency forces bad trades. Urgency sells the future. Urgency invites emotion into decisions. When urgency disappears, wealth has already arrived, even if the numbers are still growing. Now here's the chapter few people want to hear. Thinking like the top 1% will isolate you at times, not socially, but mentally. You will see inefficiencies others normalize. You will hear complaints that no longer resonate. You will notice cycles people repeat without awareness. And you won't always be able to explain it. Because frameworks can't be transmitted emotionally. They must be experienced. So don't evangelize. Build quietly. Let results speak later. Rich thinking is not loud. It's inevitable. Given time, given consistency, given restraint. Now let's anchor one final principle. You don't escape poor thinking by rejecting your past. You integrate it. Your struggle gave you awareness. Your limitations taught you efficiency. Your mistakes trained discernment. Nothing was wasted. The difference now is direction. you're no longer reacting, you're designing, and design changes everything. In the next message, we will close this audiobook not with hype, but with a decision point, a moment where you choose consciously whether this was just something you listened to or something that permanently restructured how you live. Because from this point forward, there is only one real question left. What are you going to build with this clarity? Chapter 14, this is the moment where most people quietly stop, not because they failed, but because continuing requires ownership. No more blaming systems, no more blaming timing, no more blaming circumstances. When thinking changes, responsibility becomes unavoidable, and responsibility is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion that someone else will fix it. This is where rich thinking separates permanently. Rich thinking does not wait for rescue. It assumes no one is coming. And instead of feeling abandoned by that truth, it feels liberated. Because if no one is coming to save you, you are free to build without permission. This is why wealthy thinkers don't ask for approval. Approval slows action. Consensus dilutes vision. Permission delays momentum. They move with internal alignment instead of external validation. Now let's address the last psychological anchor of poor thinking, the need to feel motivated. Poor thinking waits for motivation. Rich thinking builds without it. Motivation is emotional weather. It changes daily. If your progress depends on it, your future will always be unstable. Rich thinking replaces motivation with standards. Standards don't negotiate. Standards don't care how you feel. Standards don't need excitement. They exist because you decided who you are. This is why wealthy people don't feel like it every day. They don't need to. They show up because the system expects them to. And systems don't wait for inspiration. Now let's talk about time horizons. Poor thinking thinks in weeks, rent cycles, pay cycles, bills. Rich thinking thinks in decades, 5 years, 10 years, a lifetime. This does not mean ignoring the present. It means using the present to serve the future. Every decision asks a different question now. Does this improve my position long term? Does this compound or decay? Does this increase optionality or reduce it? When you ask these questions consistently, poor thinking collapses automatically. Because poor thinking cannot survive long time horizons. It relies on urgency. Remove urgency, and it dissolves. Now here is the final grounding truth. You will still experience fear. You will still experience doubt. You will still experience moments of uncertainty. Rich thinking does not eliminate emotion. It eliminates emotional authority. Emotion becomes a signal, not a command. Fear informs caution. Excitement informs opportunity. Stress informs adjustment. But none of them decide. You decide. And once decision-making authority is reclaimed, poverty thinking loses its grip. Not dramatically, permanently. Now we arrive at the closing perspective. Wealth is not an amount. It is a relationship with time, with effort, with emotion, with structure. Most people never change that relationship. They just earn more and hope it feels different. You change the relationship, and that is irreversible. Because once you see how thinking creates outcomes, you can't unsee it. Once you feel the calm of structure, chaos feels foreign. Once you experience leverage, busy work feels empty. This is not arrogance. This is evolution. In the final message, we will seal this journey with a closing reflection, with a commitment, with an invitation, not to consume more, but to build. Because From here on out, thinking will no longer keep you poor. It will make you free. Chapter 15. This is where the noise finally stops. No more chasing. No more arguing with yourself. No more pretending you don't see what you now see clearly. Poor thinking does not disappear because you reject it. It disappears because it no longer explains your life. And explanations are powerful. For years, poor thinking explained why effort didn't lead to freedom, why stress felt normal, why money never felt like enough. Now those explanations no longer fit. You understand leverage, you understand systems, you understand time horizons, you understand emotional authority, and understanding changes behavior when it is installed, not admired. This is why this audiobook was never meant to hype you. Hype fades. Structure remains. Now, let's talk about the most important transition of all, the shift from learning mode to building mode. Poor thinking loves to stay in learning mode. Learning feels safe. Learning feels productive. Learning postpones risk. But learning without building becomes intellectual procrastination. Rich thinking learns only what it needs next. Then it builds. Then it learns again from reality, not theory. Reality is the best teacher. It gives feedback fast. It punishes illusions. It rewards alignment. This is why rich thinkers respect failure, not emotionally, structurally. Failure reveals where thinking and reality are misaligned. Poor thinking takes failure personally. Rich thinking takes it diagnostically, and that difference saves years. Now let's anchor the final principle that keeps poor thinking from returning. Reduction. Rich thinking constantly reduces decisions, reduces emotional load, reduces unnecessary complexity, reduces exposure to distraction. Poor thinking adds more options, more noise, more stimulation, more comparison, and then wonders why clarity disappears. Clarity does not come from adding information. It comes from removing interference. This is why wealthy minds are quiet, not empty, focused. They don't consume endlessly. They don't react constantly. They don't chase novelty. They execute a small number of well-chosen moves consistently. Now, here is the closing truth, the one that matters most. You don't need to believe you will be wealthy. Belief is emotional. You need to behave as if structure matters more than feeling. If you do that long enough, wealth becomes a side effect, not a goal. And side effects are harder to sabotage because you're not chasing them. You're building something deeper, a way of thinking that compounds, a way of deciding that doesn't panic, a way of living that doesn't restart every year. This is what destroys poor thinking forever, not motivation, not discipline, not willpower, replacement. You replaced urgency with horizon, reaction with design, consumption with creation, emotion with structure. And once that happens, there is no return. So here is the final invitation, not a command, not a challenge, a question. What will you build now? Knowing that thinking is the real constraint, not tomorrow, not someday, but deliberately. Because from this point forward, poverty is no longer a mystery. And when a problem is no longer a mystery, it becomes optional. If this audiobook shifted something in you, hold on to that shift. And tell me this in the comments. What topic should the next audiobook dismantle next? Time, discipline, focus, identity, or purpose? Because this isn't the end. It's the moment you stop thinking small and start thinking in systems, and systems change everything. Chapter 16. Even after everything you've heard, there is one last reflex poor thinking tries to trigger. It asks quietly, What if I slip? What if I go back? What if this clarity fades? That question alone reveals how deep the old thinking went. Because poor thinking assumes progress is fragile. Rich thinking understands something different. Progress is not fragile when it is structural. You don't lose structural change the way you lose motivation. You don't forget how to think in systems once you've built them. You may hesitate. You may slow down. You may even make mistakes, but you don't revert. Because once your mind has expanded to a longer horizon, short-term thinking feels claustrophobic. Once you've experienced calm decision-making, panic feels inefficient. Once you've tasted leverage, busy work feels empty. This is why poor thinking cannot truly return. It can visit, but it cannot stay. Now let's talk about what happens after poor thinking is gone. This is the chapter no one prepares you for. You stop feeling rushed, and that can feel unsettling at first. When urgency leaves, there's a silence, and in that silence, you must choose deliberately, not reactively. Deliberate choice is heavier than reaction. Reaction lets life decide for you. Choice puts the weight back in your hands. This is why some people subconsciously recreate chaos. Chaos relieves responsibility. Rich thinking tolerates the weight of choice. It doesn't escape it. It builds frameworks to carry it. Now let's anchor the final habit that protects everything you've built. Regular recalibration. Rich thinkers don't assume they're done. They revisit assumptions. They audit systems. They ask if leverage still compounds. Not obsessively. Periodically, poor thinking avoids review because review risks discomfort. Rich thinking embraces review because review prevents decay. This is how wealth stays durable, not by perfection, by maintenance. Now consider this. Most people think wealth changes their lifestyle. In reality, it changes their relationship with time. You stop rushing mornings. You stop dreading Mondays. You stop measuring life in pay cycles. Time becomes directional instead of urgent. You start asking, what deserves my attention this year? What compounds if I say no more often? What creates optionality 5 years from now? These are not financial questions. They are thinking questions. And thinking questions create financial outcomes. Now here is the final reframe to seal everything. You were never poor because of money. You were poor because of compression. Compressed time horizons. Compressed emotional regulation. Compressed decision-making. Wealth is expansion, expanded thinking, expanded patience, expanded structure, and expansion is irreversible once experienced. You cannot unknow it. You cannot shrink back into urgency comfortably. This is why people who truly change never go back to normal. Normal feels broken. So here is the final grounding truth. You don't need to remember every concept from this audiobook. You only need to remember one principle. Anything that forces short-term thinking is expensive. Anything that supports long-term thinking is wealth. Filter decisions through that lens. Spending, career, relationships, opportunities. That lens will never mislead you. And now, before this chapter closes, let me ask you something important. If this audiobook changed how you see money, time, or yourself, even slightly, don't rush away from that. Sit with it. Write down the one belief that cracked, the one habit that feels obsolete, the one decision you now see differently. That is where real change lives. In the next and final message, we will close this book properly, not with excitement, with alignment, with a calm ending that matches the thinking you've built. Because this was never about becoming someone else. It was about becoming structurally free. Chapter 17. There is nothing dramatic left to say. And that's intentional, because poor thinking thrives on drama, on urgency, on emotional spikes that feel like momentum. What you've built here does not need intensity. It needs continuity. Real wealth thinking is not loud when it arrives. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and starts changing behavior before identity catches up. You stop explaining yourself. You stop rushing decisions. You stop defending long-term choices to short-term minds, not out of arrogance, out of clarity. And clarity doesn't argue. Now let's talk about the final misconception people have about wealth thinking. They believe it makes life rigid, controlled, predictable, boring. The opposite is true. Poor thinking is rigid because it reacts the same way every time. Stress leads to relief. Fear leads to retreat. Opportunity leads to hesitation. Rich thinking is flexible because it is anchored in systems, anchored in time horizons, anchored in emotional regulation. Flexibility without anchors is chaos. Anchors without flexibility is stagnation. Wealth thinking holds both. That's why it lasts. Now consider this. You will still experience temptation, shortcuts, trends, urgent offers, easy wins that promise speed, but you will feel the misalignment immediately now, that tightening in the chest, that sense of rushing, that subtle pull toward short-term relief. That feeling is no longer confusing. It's diagnostic. It tells you when something does not compound. And once you can feel misalignment, you don't need willpower. You just step away. This is the final upgrade. Intuition trained by structure. Now here is the quiet truth few people ever articulate. Most people never stay poor because they lack opportunity. They stay poor because they never slowed down long enough to redesign how they think. They were busy surviving, busy reacting, busy coping. You stepped out of that loop, and loops are powerful. Once you exit one, you don't fall back in accidentally. Now there is one final responsibility. Not to hustle, not to grind, not to prove anything, but to protect your thinking. Protect it from noise, from urgency disguised as importance, from environments that normalize reaction. You don't need to isolate yourself. You just need to curate inputs carefully, because what you consume trains what you tolerate, and what you tolerate becomes your life. Rich thinking is not fragile, but it is selective. Now let's close this with something practical. From this point forward, measure progress differently, not by income alone, not by speed, not by visible wins. Measure it by how calm your decisions feel, how rarely you panic, how few financial emergencies you experience, how little money occupies your emotional space. Those are signals of real wealth, and those signals appear before the numbers explode. Now we are at the end, not of growth, not of ambition, but of poor thinking, and endings matter. So let's end this properly. In the final message, I will leave you with one closing frame, one sentence you can return to whenever pressure returns. Because pressure will return, but this time it won't control you. Chapter 18, Final. Here is the sentence to keep, not as a mantra, not as motivation, as a filter. If it forces short-term thinking, it is expensive, no matter how good it feels. If it supports long-term thinking, it is wealth, even if it feels uncomfortable now. Return to that sentence whenever pressure rises, when urgency tells you to rush, when emotion asks you to trade tomorrow for relief, when comfort invites you to stop building too early. That sentence will never lie to you, because poor thinking always compresses time, and wealth always expands it. You don't need to remember every chapter of this audiobook. You don't need to replay every idea. You only need to notice how you think now. You pause more. You react less. You design instead of chase. You choose alignment over relief. That's not information. That's transformation. And transformation doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and then changes everything. From here forward, your job is simple. Protect the horizon. Protect the systems. Protect the calm. Let other people rush. Let other people react. Let other people trade decades for dopamine. You don't need to convince anyone. Your life will explain it for you. And before you go, let me ask you something, not as a call to action, but as a moment of awareness. What belief about money, success, or yourself no longer fits after listening to this? Name it. Write it down. Release it. And if this audiobook gave you clarity, not hype, if it made money feel quieter, not louder, if it made you think longer, not faster, then you already know what to do. Build deliberately, move patiently, think structurally, and tell me this in the comments. What should the next audiobook dismantle next? Time, focus, discipline, identity, or purpose? Because once poor thinking is destroyed, you don't need motivation, you have direction. And direction, given time, changes everything.